Sloan Ashbourne set the invoice on the counter, $199, and told the mechanic he had no right to charge her for touching a car he wasn't cleared to service. Graham Holt didn't argue. The single father pulled off his oil-stained gloves, returned the keys to the prototype, and walked back into his small garage without a word. The next morning, Harrison Ashbourne, the billionaire founder whose empire his daughter now ran, walked through that same door with a lawyer and a check for $19 million. But the money wasn't a reward. It was a debt the company had been hiding for 11 years. Stay with this story to the end and find out how $199 broke open a $19 million secret. The Ashbourne Tempest was the most expensive vehicle Sloan Ashbourne had ever refused to admit she didn't fully understand. A carbon fiber prototype worth somewhere north of $400,000 that she drove herself on public roads because she believed demonstrating personal confidence in the product was the job of a CEO. She had a meeting with a group of infrastructure investors in 40 minutes, the kind of meeting that could push the Tempest's launch timeline forward by an entire quarter, and the last thing she expected was for the car to lose power on the ramp of the 101 freeway just south of Oxnard. The dashboard went amber first, then a cluster of warnings she didn't recognize, and by the time she coasted to the shoulder and called the company's technical support line, the operator had already told her the nearest field response team was at minimum 90 minutes away. She sat in 83-degree heat on a concrete shoulder and weighed her options, and the map on her phone showed a single automotive facility within reasonable walking distance, a name she didn't recognize at a cross street she had never turned onto. The garage was 2 blocks off the highway, a place she would have driven past 100 times without noticing. A clean but modest building with a hand-lettered sign above the bay door that read Holt Prosecution Garage and below it, in smaller letters, Honest Work, Fair Price. Graham Holt was finishing a brake inspection on a landscaper's truck when Sloan walked in without knocking, stated that she needed her car looked at immediately, and made it clear by the angle of her shoulders and the pace of her speech that she was not accustomed to waiting. Graham didn't react to the tone. He set down his wrench, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and walked out to the curb where the Tempest sat at an angle that suggested it had been pushed the last 20 yards into the lot. He crouched beside the driver's door and sat still for 10 seconds, listening, not to Sloan's explanation of the warning codes, which she was providing, but to the thermal cycling sound coming from beneath the chassis, a particular oscillation in the frequency range that indicated pressure fluctuation behind a valve under irregular load. He told her the thermal balance valve was closing at the wrong interval, most likely triggered by a miscalibrated sensor in the primary cooling loop, and that if she attempted to push the car to highway speed again, she risked a cascade failure in the battery management system that would render the entire drive unit non-responsive. Sloan asked how he could possibly diagnose a proprietary system he had never been cleared to service, and Graham answered by describing the precise acoustic signature that indicated pressure buildup behind a misaligned valve, a description so technically specific that her support engineer, still on hold in her hand, went quiet on the other end of the line. Graham spent just under an hour running diagnostics with his own equipment, isolating the sensor fault, applying a temporary firmware workaround, and disabling the high-performance acceleration mode to prevent the vehicle from generating thermal load it could no longer safely manage. When he returned to the counter and wrote out the invoice, the total was $199. Sloan read the number twice. Then she read the line items. Diagnostic labor. 1 replacement sensor coupling, system verification. She asked why the performance mode had been disabled without her authorization, and Graham explained that re-enabling it before the root sensor was properly replaced would expose the battery pack to temperatures above its rated tolerance. Sloane's response was to tell him, in a measured and deliberate voice, two mechanics and a waiting customer heard every word, that he had slowed down a vehicle that wasn't his to modify, charged her for a decision she hadn't requested, and that an independent shop had no standing to intervene in Ashbourne proprietary technology. She placed the invoice face down on the counter, took her keys, and walked out to the lot where her assistant had arrived with a company transport. Graham did not follow her to the door and did not raise his voice. He picked the invoice back up. On the reverse side, he wrote the fault code, the sensor part number, the threshold temperature the system had reached before he intervened, and a single line of text. Valve failure at speed will cause full drive loss. He set the paper on the counter and walked back to the landscaper's truck. When the Tempest pulled out of the lot, he stood in the bay doorway and watched the logo on the trunk panel until the car rounded the corner and disappeared, and he stood there a moment longer than he needed to, turning something over in the back of his mind that he hadn't touched in a very long time. The sound that cooling loop made, the specific pitch of the oscillation, the timing of the pressure drop, was not a sound he was encountering for the first time. Every vehicle in Ashbourne Motors' prototype program was networked to a central diagnostic cloud, a feature that existed primarily to allow engineers to monitor the health of unreleased platforms in real time and flag anything that deviated from expected parameters. The Tempest was no exception, and within 3 hours of leaving the garage, the car had automatically uploaded a complete service record, fault codes, the firmware workaround applied, the name and address of the facility that had performed the repair, and the technician on record. Harrison Ashbourne wasn't supposed to be reviewing prototype telemetry at his age, and his doctors had been specific about reducing the cognitive load of high-stakes monitoring, and his daughter had been equally specific about him staying away from operational data. But Harrison had spent 40 years building cars, and there were still evenings when he opened the company's internal diagnostic dashboard from the study of his Montecito home the way other men of his generation opened old notebooks. He saw the name on the service record and went still. Graham Holt, Holt Precision Garage, a street address in Ventura County. Harrison set his glass very carefully on the side table, picked up his phone, and called Lila Monroe before the thought had fully resolved into words. Lila Monroe was the intellectual property attorney he had retained 8 months earlier, quietly and without board notification, after a routine portfolio audit had surfaced a discrepancy in the ownership documentation for one of Ashbourne's most foundational technologies. A thermal management system that appeared in the core specification of every electric vehicle the company had produced since its third model year. The original patent filing had named the inventor only as GH, an abbreviated notation that had survived 2 subsequent renewals, and the chain of title documentation included a transfer agreement bearing a signature that Lila, who had spent 2 decades working fraud cases before transitioning to intellectual property, had flagged as inconsistent with every other signing event in the contractor's file. For 8 months, she had been searching for the person behind those 2 letters. The address in company records led to postal box in Sacramento that had been closed for 9 years. The phone number connected to a line registered under a different name. The tax identification number in the contractor file had been transposed, not by enough to trigger an automated flag, but by enough to ensure that any records search using the original information would return nothing useful. She had found a handful of technical reports from the early development period that referenced a contract engineer whose handwriting appeared in the margins, the same angular notation, the same cross-section valves schematics. but she had no name to attach to the handwriting, until the service record from Holt Precision Garage appeared in the cloud at 11:47 on a Tuesday evening. Harrison arrived at the garage the following morning at 7:45 with Lila beside him and a bank instrument in his jacket pocket that he had authorized the previous night from the company's audit settlement account, a check representing the figure the audit had calculated as the sum of unpaid royalties, 11 years of accumulated interest, regulatory penalties for misfiled patent documentation, and restitution for the damage done to the original inventor's professional standing. Sloan was in the passenger seat before the car reached the highway. She had been awake since before 5 and sat rigid and unconvinced for the entire drive, rehearsing an argument about what she was watching her father prepare to do: hand $19 million of company money to a mechanic who had spent one afternoon with a car he had never been authorized to service, based on a document whose signature discrepancy could as easily reflect a clerical error as a fraud. Harrison placed the check on Graham's workbench without ceremony, said he was sorry that it had taken this long, and told Graham the money had been calculated and verified and was his without condition. Graham looked at the check for a measured moment and then looked at Harrison, and the question he asked was not about the money at all. He asked how many vehicles were currently running his design. Harrison told him the number without pause: 83,412 units across 6 production models, with a cumulative revenue contribution the audit had placed at just over $340 million. Graham absorbed that figure the way a man receives information that confirms something he had half known for a long time, without shock, but with the kind of settling weight that changes the composition of a room. He asked to see the audit report, the transfer addendum that had been used to justify the ownership claim, and the methodology behind the $19 million figure. Lila placed a bound summary on the workbench beside the check, walked him through the calculation line by line, and explained that the payment was fully substantiated, that it had been calculated conservatively rather than aggressively, and that it came with no non-disclosure condition attached. She had argued for that last point explicitly, and Harrison had agreed to it without debate. She also told him, more carefully, that there was a secondary document, a settlement finalization form, that would acknowledge the payment as satisfying the outstanding royalty obligation. It did not extinguish any other claims she was quick to clarify, but it would constitute a formal acceptance of the audit scope if he signed it. Graham read the finalization form slowly, twice, and set it beside the check without picking up a pen. His objection was stated without heat. The form as written acknowledged the financial calculation but contained no language addressing the restoration of his name on the invention record, and no provision requiring an assessment of the current safety status of the thermal management system as deployed in production vehicles. Those were not addenda he intended to negotiate away in exchange for money he had already been owed. Sloan, standing near the garage bay with her coffee untouched and cooling in her hand, said that he was attaching conditions to a settlement that was already more than generous, and that refusing to sign an acknowledgement of a payment he had just been handed was the behavior of someone who was positioning for a larger number. Graham looked at her with the even attention of a man who is trying to understand something rather than argue against it. And he told her plainly that if money had been his primary concern, the form would already be signed, and he would be on the phone with a roofer about the back section of this building. What concerned him was that the Tempest she had been driving that day was running a version of his original thermal balance architecture from which a critical redundancy had been removed. The original design had included a secondary bypass valve that would engage automatically if the primary cooling sensor lost integrity at speed. That valve had been eliminated from the production specification to reduce per-unit cost and trim weight from the chassis, and the result was a system that performed correctly under standard conditions and became dangerous under the specific combination of heat, load, and sensor drift that highway driving in summer could reliably produce. Harrison looked at Sloan and said the Tempest launch should be paused, pending an independent review of the thermal architecture. Sloan said that the launch was tied to commitments made to a consortium whose combined forward position represented $600 million in capital, and that delaying the event would require explanations the company was not positioned to give. Dean Crow had been in the building since before any of them arrived, watching through the service bay window, and when Sloan walked back to the parking lot to take a call, he fell into step beside her and told her, in the measured tone of a man offering a corrective, that she should know Graham Holt had been terminated from his Ashbourne contract 11 years ago for removing proprietary technical files, and that the technology he was currently claiming to have invented was the very technology he had been dismissed for allegedly stealing. Dean Crow brought the personnel file the following afternoon. A physical folder, not a digital record, the kind that arrives in a person's hands carrying the implicit authority of institutional permanence. Inside, it was a termination summary that described Graham Holt as a contract engineer dismissed for cause following an internal investigation into the unauthorized removal of proprietary documentation and the deliberate deletion of experimental test data from a shared server. There was a witness statement from a facilities manager who confirmed Graham had badged out of the technical development building with a bag that had not been logged on entry. There was a legal hold notice issued in Graham's name, later closed without prosecution. A detail Dean framed as corporate mercy rather than as evidence that the case had been unsustainable. He told Sloan privately that Harrison was 77 years old and that 3 years of declining health had made him susceptible to any narrative that offered a chance to correct an old wrong, and that the auditors Lila Monroe represented had been retained under Harrison's personal authority without board approval, which was technically accurate in the same way that a map showing roads without showing elevation is technically accurate. Graham's version, delivered the same evening in a meeting Lila had requested and Sloan had attended against her initial judgment, was different in nearly every particular. He described the thermal problem he had identified during a prototype stress test in his 3rd year on contract, a test the company's engineers had certified as passed, despite data showing the primary cooling loop was losing pressure under sustained high load. He had spent 4 months of evenings and approximately $12,000 of his own savings designing the balance valve system in his home garage, working outside the facility on purpose because he had wanted the origin of the design to be unambiguous before he brought it forward. He had brought it to Dean Crow. Dean had asked to keep the notebook over a long weekend for review. When Graham returned on Monday, he was told the engineering team had evaluated the concept and found it technically interesting but insufficiently developed, and that the company would pursue its own internal solution. 3 weeks later, the solution filed with the Patent Office contained every significant element Graham had designed. When Graham went back to Dean, his access credentials were deactivated the following morning, and the termination letter arrived by end of week. He had not fought it in court because 7 weeks after the termination notice, his wife Diane was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. He had a 4-year-old daughter, a treatment schedule that would cost more than he had, and a legal case against a capitalized corporation that would take years and carry no guarantee of outcome. He had made the calculation that every parent eventually faces, and he had chosen the only thing he could not afford to lose. He kept one notebook, the original spiral-bound composition book in which he had sketched the valve concept. but acknowledged that several pages were missing, torn away during the confrontation in Dean's office, when the notebook had been grabbed from his hands and returned to him damaged. Leela asked to see the notebook. She turned through the last 30 pages, studied the binding margins, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said that the electronic signature on the transfer addendum, the document authorizing the ownership transfer from Graham to the company, had a timestamp placing the signing event on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 days after Graham's building access credentials had already been deactivated. Sloane spent the night at her father's house for the first time in 4 years, sitting at the kitchen table with the audit summary and a pot of coffee that went cold before she was through the middle sections, reading every page in sequence rather than scanning for conclusions. She had built her professional reputation on trusting her team to manage complexity so that she could manage direction. And she had believed for a long time that this was not a weakness, but an efficient allocation of expertise. What the audit summary was showing her, page by page, was that the division of labor she had trusted had been structured by at least one person on her team to keep her uninformed in exactly the ways that protected him. She was not yet fully convinced that Graham's account of 11-year-old events was accurate in every detail. She understood enough about disputed histories to know that both sides can carry selective truth. But the metadata discrepancy Lila had identified was not a narrative. A timestamp did not have a perspective. Dean met with her the following morning before the building had filled, and his argument was the argument of a man who has calculated that forward pressure is his only remaining option. He told her that Graham Holt's reemergence in the specific week before the Tempest launch was not coincidence. That a person with a grievance, even a colorable one, could time his reappearance for maximum commercial leverage, and that the investor event she was protecting was worth more to the company's employees, shareholders, and long-term mission than any individual claim. He asked her directly whether she was prepared to cancel a 9-figure commitment event because a former contractor had positioned his story in the path of her prototype at a convenient moment. Sloane told him she was gathering information, which was not the answer he had come for. She called Graham that afternoon and proposed a controlled technical evaluation. If an independent review conducted under her authority at the Ashbourne Technical Center found the current Tempest configuration safe within operating parameters, she would ask her father to separate the patent dispute from the launch timeline. If the review found a material safety deficiency, she would act on it regardless of the commercial consequence. Graham agreed, with one modification: he wanted to be present as a technical observer, not as a decision-maker. He arrived at the facility the following morning with nothing except a single page of handwritten diagnostic parameters, and the engineers assigned to the review treated his presence with the careful skepticism that specialists extend to outsiders until an outsider demonstrates that he is not one. He identified a diagnostic gap in the first 40 minutes. The vehicle's onboard monitoring system had been configured to suppress thermal alerts below a threshold 12 degrees higher than the design specification. Not a calibration refinement, but a programmatic change applied to the alert logic itself, so that the car would report its temperature as normal at readings that Graham's original framework would have flagged as requiring immediate response. The engineers argued it was a user experience adjustment meant to reduce false positive warnings during performance driving. Graham walked to the whiteboard and wrote 3 numbers: the temperature at which the battery management system initiated protective current reduction, the temperature at which the primary cooling loop lost capacity without the secondary valve, and the gap between the suppressed alert threshold and the point of no return for battery integrity. The gap was 9 degrees. When he asked the team lead to pull the telemetry log from the specific Tempest that had come off the 101 9 days earlier, The record showed 3 separate events during that single drive in which the suppressed sensor had climbed past the real threshold without alerting the driver. The approval signature on the alert threshold modification belonged to Dean Crow. By the following morning, a version of events had reached 3 automotive news outlets. A version that described Graham Holt as a disgruntled former contractor pursuing a decade-old grievance through an unauthorized repair of a prototype vehicle, now seeking $19 million for work completed under a contract he had already been paid to fulfill. The story cited no named sources, and it did not allege criminal conduct, but it framed Graham's presence in the conversation as an opportunistic intrusion at a commercially sensitive moment, and that framing was sufficient to begin doing damage in the specific ways that reputational pressure damages small businesses. 3 regular customers called to cancel appointments in a single afternoon. A fleet account that had sent commercial vehicles to the garage for 6 years notified Graham by email that it was pausing the relationship pending clarification of the reported dispute. The small business lender holding the note on the shop's equipment sent a letter advising that the existence of unresolved litigation could constitute a covenant violation and requesting a written response within 15 business days. None of these pressures were accidental, and Graham understood their architecture clearly enough to know they had not originated with a journalist who had good sources. Dean's separate communication arrived through a third party who identified himself as a corporate affairs consultant, not through legal channels and not through the company. A personal offer, constructed to leave no trail that connected directly to its sender. The offer was uncomplicated. The check Harrison had already prepared would be delivered under a revised settlement form that removed the conditions Graham had objected to. The patent dispute would be quietly settled outside the public record, and no further inquiry would be made into the history of the technology. In exchange, Graham would sign a comprehensive confidentiality agreement and would not seek to have his name attached to any filing, record, or public statement associated with the thermal management system. Graham read the offer twice, forwarded it to Lila Monroe, and then called his daughter. June was 16 and had been tracking the coverage from her phone at school, and her voice on the call had the particular steadiness of a teenager who is trying not to sound more afraid than she is. She asked him whether they were going to lose the garage, and he told her honestly that it was possible, that the financial pressure being applied was real, and that he could stop it within 24 hours by signing a document he had already been offered. She asked why he wasn't signing it, and he said that the vehicles carrying the incomplete version of his design were still on roads, and that if he signed a confidentiality agreement while that remained true and something failed at speed, he would have made a decision in this conversation that he could not afterward undo. June was quiet long enough that Graham thought the call had dropped. Then she said she understood. It was more than he had expected her to say, and it cost him something to hear it. Harrison issued a public statement the following day, confirming that the payment under discussion had originated from an independent audit, was unrelated to services rendered at the garage, and reflected a contractual obligation that the company had failed to honor over an extended period. The statement didn't end the coverage, but it removed the most damaging implication and forced the framing of the original story to recalibrate. The board responded by convening an emergency committee to review the propriety of Harrison's use of the audit account, technically within his authority as a founding shareholder, but characterized by several members as a unilateral action that bypassed governance channels. Dean supported the committee with visible enthusiasm. That evening, an anonymous digital file arrived in Graham's email. The audio was from an internal meeting 11 years earlier. In it, a man whose voice matched samples already on file from Dean's participation in an unrelated deposition gave explicit instructions. Remove GH from the contributor line of the thermal balance specification before it goes to the patent attorney, and do not log the change in the revision history. The email arrived without a message, only the audio file attached, and the sending address resolved to a free account created 4 hours earlier. Graham listened to the recording twice before forwarding it to Lila. She had the metadata reviewed independently, and the file was confirmed as authentic, recorded on a device logged into the company's internal network on a date placing the event during the original patent filing process, with a voice pattern match sufficient for formal evidentiary use. 2 days later, a handwritten letter arrived at the garage by ordinary mail, written in careful block print on plain paper. The letter was from Owen Bell, 62 years old, formerly a test systems engineer at Ashbourne Motors, retired for 6 years. Owen wrote that he had been in the room when the notebook was taken. He had watched Dean Crow remove the relevant pages and place them in a separate folder while Graham was being walked out of the building by Human Resources under the termination protocol. He had said nothing at the time because he had a wife, 2 children in middle school, and a mortgage on a house in Thousand Oaks, and because he had told himself for 11 years that the technical record would eventually surface on its own without his intervention. He wrote that it had not surfaced on its own, and that seeing Graham's name in the news cycle had finally made it impossible for him to sustain the argument that his silence was neutral. Graham drove to Owen's house on a Wednesday afternoon. Owen met him at the door, and neither of them tried to make the opening easy. Graham sat at the kitchen table and listened to everything Owen had to say, and when Owen finished, Graham sat with the anger that had been in him a long time. The anger of a man who lost years and reputation and financial security, not because he was outcompeted, but because a specific person made a deliberate choice to take from him what was his. He told Owen the anger was real, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. He also said that Owen coming forward was the correct action, and that the correct action being difficult did not make it less necessary. Owen told him where the missing pages were. Dean had filed them inside a physical archive folder under a discontinued project code, a closed research initiative whose storage records had never been digitized, sitting in a secondary warehouse in Camarillo, invisible to any search that used Graham's name or the thermal balance patent as a reference point. Sloan and Lila drove to the warehouse on Thursday, Sloan presenting her CEO credentials and completing the retrieval request on site. The folder was where Owen had placed it. Inside were 11 pages of graph-ruled notebook paper covered in the same angular handwriting visible in the margins of every technical document from that period, with dates at the top of each entry that placed the first valve design sketches 14 months before Graham's contract with Ashbourne Motors had begun. The thermal balance system had existed before the contract. It had never been transferred. It had only been taken. Sloan scheduled the technical evaluation for the following Monday, arranging it through the Regulatory Liaison Office rather than through the company's internal communications chain, and she invited 3 parties who had not previously been in the room together: the technical safety officer from the State Vehicle Compliance Division, the lead representative from the investor consortium, and Graham Holt. She told Dean only that she was conducting a mandatory pre-launch safety confirmation, which was accurate, and which was the kind of statement that could not be objected to without creating a written record of the objection. The evaluation was conducted on a dynamometer, a controlled test platform that allowed the vehicle to be run at simulated highway speed under full load without leaving the facility, with automatic safety shutoffs calibrated to engage before any failure could cause structural damage. Graham stood to the side of the platform with a tablet showing real-time thermal telemetry, and the protocol he had provided that morning required the testing team to simulate 3 conditions simultaneously: sustained high-load operation, ambient chamber temperature above 95 degrees, and the deliberate disabling of the primary cooling sensor to replicate the failure mode his diagnostic work had identified. The engineers ran the first two conditions without objection. The third required Sloane's direct written authorization, which she provided. The sequence began at 11:20 in the morning. For the first 6 minutes, the Tempest performed within expected parameters. Then the primary sensor was cut. In the original design, this would have triggered the secondary balance valve within 4 seconds, reducing the thermal load on the battery pack while the primary system recovered. In the current configuration, there was no secondary valve. There was only the suppressed alert threshold, which the car crossed without reporting, and then the battery management controller attempting to manage a heat load it had not been designed to handle alone. And then the temperature figure on the monitor climbing through the range Graham had drawn on the whiteboard 10 days earlier, climbing steadily until the automatic shutoff triggered at 107 degrees. That was 14 degrees above the threshold that should have triggered a driver alert, and 22 degrees above the point where the secondary valve would have engaged in the original specification. No vehicle was damaged. No person was at risk. The test had been constructed precisely to prevent either outcome, but the number on the monitor required no interpretation from anyone in the room. Graham held up a component from his jacket pocket, a brass valve assembly the size of a large walnut, $37 from the original parts supplier, and said that this piece, multiplied across the production run, added approximately $300 per vehicle to the build cost. The per-unit savings from eliminating it had been $312. The decision to remove it had been made by a single person, and the person who had authorized the thermal alert suppression was the same person who had made that decision. Dean Crow, standing near the back wall at an angle that made direct eye contact difficult, said that the engineering change order had been routed through the standard approval process and that the CEO had been listed as final authority. He said Sloane had signed it. The engineering change order was real. Sloane had signed it 18 months earlier as part of a cost optimization package submitted during the quarterly efficiency review. One document in a bundle of 43, each representing a line item decision her team had already vetted, presented in a format designed for rapid executive authorization. Her signature was genuine, and it was uninformed, and she understood clearly that the distinction between those two qualities, which felt substantial from the inside, was considerably harder to perceive from the outside, where the test results and the temperature number and the 3 unalerted thermal events from the 101 were all sitting in the same room. Sloane stood in front of the investor representative, the compliance officer, and Graham Holt, and said that she had signed the document. She said she had not understood what she was signing because she had not read it with adequate attention, and that this was not a defense but a description of how a safety-critical engineering decision had been buried inside an administrative process designed to minimize executive scrutiny. She said she accepted responsibility for having created the conditions that allowed that process to operate the way it had, and she was not going to offer Dean Crow's conduct as a justification for a different assessment of her own. Graham waited until she had finished and said, without emphasis, that the difference between a mistake made in negligence and a decision made in bad faith was not primarily a question of culpability. Courts and auditors would work through that in their own time, but a question of what a person chose to do after the mistake became clear. He had watched her look at the temperature number on the monitor. He had seen the moment it registered. The formal investigation into Dean Crow moved through the company's legal department with the support of Lila Monroe's audit documentation, Owen Bell's sworn testimony, The warehouse archive pages with their pre-contract dates, the audio recording, the metadata analysis of the forged transfer signature, and the vehicle diagnostic record showing that his office had authorized the thermal alert suppression. Within 48 hours of the technical evaluation, Dean's operational access was suspended and his credentials deactivated, a symmetry that Graham noted when he heard about it, though he didn't say so aloud. The board convened to determine whether Sloan would remain. Several members argued that her signature on the change order and her failure to identify Dean's conduct over years of his tenure constituted a governance failure too significant to remediate with structural reform. Others argued that her response after learning the facts, halting the launch, authorizing the independent test, accepting accountability in public, was precisely the behavior the board should want to preserve in its leadership. Harrison sat through the session without speaking until the vote was called. He said one sentence: that Sloan had made the right choice when the cost of making it was at its highest, and that he intended to vote accordingly. The vote was 7-4. Sloan was sitting in her car in the parking structure when Leela called with the result, because she hadn't trusted herself to hold her expression in a hallway. The board reconvened 2 weeks later for a formal session recorded by legal counsel, attended by parties whose presence changed the register of what could be said informally. Graham arrived at the scheduled time in work clothes, not a suit, not a deliberate statement of anything, simply what he wore on days he worked, because he had driven from the garage and not changed. He carried one item, the original invoice, $199, still unpaid, which he placed on the conference table, without preamble and without explanation. He told the board that he had not come to advocate for a particular outcome regarding Sloan Ashbourne's continued leadership, and that they were better positioned than he was to make that determination. What he had come to say was simpler. The invoice on the table in front of them had initiated a sequence of events not because of its amount, but because of the reasoning behind the decision to refuse it. A CEO's choice to decline $199 to a mechanic she had judged as beneath her had caused his name to appear in a service record that a founder had been trying to locate across 8 months and 3 dead-end address trails. The contempt behind the decision had been the variable that changed everything, not the dollar amount, not the service, but the assumption that the man holding the wrench was not worth the inconvenience of paying. He also said that Sloan Ashbourne had made serious errors, signing technical documents she had not understood, extending trust to her management team without verification, and allowing a fraud to operate inside the company for more than a decade, while she managed from the level of strategy rather than substance. These were not minor failures, and he was not standing before the board to minimize them. But she had been the first person in the executive leadership of Ashbourne Motors to halt a 9-figure commercial event after encountering evidence that the product was not safe, and she had done it at a moment when the personal cost was fully visible to her. That mattered, not as a cancellation of what had preceded it, but as evidence of the quality a leader most needed: the capacity to choose the harder, correct action over the easier, convenient one when no one was in a position to make her. He proposed a structural change, an independent technical safety committee, not advisory, but holding a binding mandate to halt any product launch pending safety certification, with authority that could not be overridden by the CEO. He suggested Sloan remain in her role on the condition that she accepted this limitation on executive authority in writing, and that the company establish a formal channel through which engineering personnel could escalate safety concerns to the independent committee without routing them through management hierarchy. He finished by saying the committee would need people who understood how thermal systems failed under real-world conditions, and that he knew a retired test engineer in Camarillo who owed the company a few honest years of work. The board adopted the proposal with minor amendments. Before the session closed, Sloan reached into the folder beside her and wrote a personal check for $200, not from the company account, from her own, and slid it across the table. She said the additional dollar was interest. Graham folded the check once and placed it in his chest pocket, then folded the $199 invoice to match and put it beside the check. The $19 million instrument Harrison had placed on his workbench 3 weeks earlier remained on the counter in his garage, unsigned. The revised settlement agreement took 11 days to draft and 4 more for Graham to review with an independent attorney he retained himself. Not from any firm Leela recommended, because he wanted a reviewer with no prior relationship to any party in the room. The final document contained 3 conditions, each of which had to be satisfied before the financial settlement would be considered complete. The first was the formal restoration of his name as the originating inventor on the thermal balance patent and all derivative applications, with an amended filing submitted to the United States Patent and Trademark Office within 60 days. The second was a funded recall and inspection program for all production vehicles carrying the thermal management system without the original secondary valve, with repairs conducted at no cost to vehicle owners and completed within 18 months. The third was the establishment of an independently governed whistleblower protection fund, seeded with $2 million, providing legal and financial support for engineers who reported safety violations through official channels and faced retaliation as a result. Harrison signed as the founding shareholder. Sloan signed as the chief executive officer. The figure on the instrument was $19 million. Graham used a portion of the settlement to retire the equipment loan, commission the structural renovation he had been deferring for 3 years, and establish what he incorporated as the Holt Technical Standards Institute, a small, independent facility offering third-party safety verification for automotive systems, staffed by engineers vetted for both technical competence and a documented commitment to uncompromised reporting. Owen Bell joined the institute as a senior analyst under an agreement requiring him to make his prior testimony part of the public record. He spent his first month writing a case study that was later adopted by 2 university engineering ethics programs. The Tempest was redesigned over the following 10 months. The secondary valve reinstated, the thermal alert thresholds restored to their original specifications, the suppression software replaced entirely. When the vehicle passed final safety certification, it exceeded the original performance benchmarks because the engineers working on the revision had been instructed to optimize for safety first and performance second, and a thermal system that didn't fail under stress turned out to sustain higher output for longer than one made brittle by cost reduction. Sloan began appearing at the garage on Saturday mornings. Not every week, but often enough that Graham's service writer stopped being surprised by her car in the lot. She didn't come to discuss the company. She came because she had asked Graham to teach her to read a diagnostic report the way a trained technician reads one, starting from the anomaly rather than the summary, trusting the data before the interpretation, sitting with what the numbers actually said before deciding what they meant. He was a patient teacher. She was a better student than she had been a CEO, which required admitting that first. June was in the lobby the afternoon the amended patent certificate arrived, framed at Graham's request. She read her father's name on the document for a long moment before she spoke. She said the settlement had made them wealthier than she had ever expected, and that was true, and it mattered. But the name on that certificate, she told him, was the thing that had let him stand up straight again. And that was worth more than any figure a check could carry. The same way $199 had turned out to be worth more than $19 million, because it was the price at which the truth had finally been paid.